Hello and welcome to Catholic Answers Live, and a very happy feast day to you. Today is the Feast of All Saints, one of the great feasts, one of the ancient feasts of the Catholic Church, when we remember all the saints of the Catholic Church. And that means that we're off today, actually, because these big feasts we take off here at Catholic Answers when they fall on a weekday. And so a little pre-record for you today. Jimmy Akin, our guest, both hours, and both hours, internet open forum. We got lots and lots of questions. This is one thing we have no shortage of around here, questions. And they come in all different ways. And Jimmy gathers up the internet questions, and we get to ask him today. So I will probably, as I usually say, I will probably give out the number. But when I do, that will be a mistake because we don't have phones today. It's all from the internet. Jimmy Akin is the senior apologist here at Catholic Answers. Many, many people know him from Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, the very popular podcast that tackles mysteries of all kinds. And now also the proprietor of the Jimmy Akin podcast. Hello, Jimmy Akin.
Howdy, Si. Now, you mentioned that we tend to take off not just major feasts, but holy days of obligation.
Oh, yeah.
When,
okay. Right.
they occur on weekdays. And the flip side of that is we don't take off a lot of federal holidays. So, if there may be some federal holiday, we're busy at work, but we take off the holy days instead.
Yeah, which is actually I kind of like that in a certain way because of the traffic. Mm-hmm. I get that, like when you're working on a federal holiday, it is just a smooth breeze coming into work. But
I've noticed that. I encounter very little traffic on those days on the route from my bedroom to my home office.
Yeah, it's a little bit less of a commute for you. I get the old COVID feeling back. Remember when we were commuting in here with COVID? The clear freeways of California. I don't want to get too nostalgic about a worldwide pandemic. However, how about what's on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World this week?
Well, we kind of have an expanded Halloween celebration, and so we're doing Halloween weird questions. A while back, we did a weird question show for Halloween. We used the first hour of it last Friday. We used the second hour of it this Friday, so kind of an extra long Halloween, to borrow a quote from Batman, The Long Halloween.
Is that I don't.
It's a story arc.
Oh, okay. All right. You can check out Jim. I'll ask you in a little bit about the Jimmy Akin podcast, because now that we've got so many things to refer to, I got to space them out a little bit. But check out Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World at mysterious.fm or wherever you get your podcasts, or check it out on YouTube. Jimmy has so much stuff available for you on YouTube. Check it out there. All right, Jimmy, here's a question for you. Humble Servant 0707 asks, I was in an OCIA class last week, and Abraham's sons were brought up. One proclaimed Sarah's push for Abraham to have a baby caused the world problems through Ishmael's line till today. Can you elaborate? Is that line cursed, or is this some consequence to Sarah and Abraham's impatience?
Well, we don't have evidence that the line of Ishmael's cursed. There's no reference to a curse being placed upon it in Genesis. In fact, God says good things about it. He says it's not going to be the line of promise that's going to come not through Ishmael, but through Isaac. But, when Ishmael's born, it's made clear he's going to be the father of a great people. And according to Genesis, that happened. They had various, national ethnic groups coming from Ishmael. These groups had a sometimes good, sometimes bad relationship with the Israelites. There are passages that will talk about Edomites, Edom being another name for Ishmael. But there are passages that say things like, don't despise an Edomite, for he is your brother. On the other hand, there are other passages where the Edomites failed to come to Israel's help militarily, and those speak more negatively. It's like, you guys weren't there for us when we needed you, and you just stood back and laughed at our military troubles, and you're going to get some judgment for that. But this is not different than the way God treats Israel. When they obey God and do good, they get blessings. When they disobey God and do bad, they get less blessings.
Mm-hmm.
I think that part of this situation is, or part of the modern interpretation of this is that it is commonly reputed today that Arabs are descended from Ishmael. And in fact, there are Muslim sources that claim this, that will say, oh no, it wasn't through Isaac that the line of blessing continued, it was through Ishmael. And there are stories about, in the Muslim community, about things Abraham did with Ishmael. And because there's a fractious relationship today between Muslims and Jews, people could look at that and say, oh, that's caused problems for us down to today. Well, okay, there are two things I'd say in regard to that. The first one is that we don't have evidence for a curse here. You know, this is, even assuming that Arabs are descended from Ishmael, it's just normal fractious Middle East politics. You know, different groups have advantages and disadvantages over time. They get into conflicts, they reconcile, they get back into conflicts. And we're currently living in a conflict phase because of the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. But there's nothing specially cursed going on here. This is just par for the course. The second thing I'd say is, I don't know that Arabs are really descended from Ishmael. Muhammad may have believed that they were, but I would want to see more proof than that. Now, there may be studies dealing with this. I have not investigated those studies, so I don't have a firm opinion here. But just because someone in the Middle East claims to be descended from someone else doesn't mean it's an accurate historical memory. In fact, we can trace the development of different ethnic groups in the Middle East and who they claim to be descended from. And sometimes it's obvious they're not all descended from who they say. They create, because these are patriarchal societies, they organize their culture by genealogy. And so if you're going to have tight relations with some group, you need to somehow share the same genealogy, and they will have genealogical mergers. And they'll refer to people being genealogized when they get written into the genealogy, and they'll be attributed this is sort of a after death legal adoption. They will be attributed to being descendants of some ancient ancestor, and say, yeah, we're all sons of him, even though the tie is really a legal one. It's like adoption, not a biological tie. So I don't know that Arabs actually carry Ishmael's genes, but I do know that they regard themselves, legally at least, as children of Abraham through Ishmael.
Humble Servant 0707, thank you very much for the question, for getting us started. It's an Ask Me Anything of the internet variety with Jimmy Akin today on Catholic Answers Live.
Catholic Answers Live.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects home buyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Magnificat. Published monthly, Magnificat features texts of daily Mass, prayers, articles, meditations, art commentaries, and more, in step with the liturgical rhythm of the Church, on the web at magnificat.com.
Hey, this is Michael O'Neill, the Miracle Hunter. I'll be delving into the fascinating world of miracles and taking you on a hunt that explores the greatest mysteries and marvels of the Catholic Church. I'll be examining what constitutes a miracle, how miracles are investigated and approved, and the role they play in the lives of the faithful. We'll look at the miracles of the Gospels and early Christianity, considering the claims of the miraculous in our own modern age.
The Miracle Hunter, tomorrow at 1 p.m. and 7 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back. Catholic Answers Live. I am Cy Kellett, your host. It is All Saints Day, and I hope you're having a beautiful All Saints Day. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and we have a million questions for Jimmy, all from the internet today. This one comes from, here I go. Esmeralda Caffey Clatch 8812. Caffey Clatch. Why is the ascension, in quotation marks, necessary?
So the ascension of Jesus into heaven is one of the elements of God's plan, but we have to qualify what we mean in terms of necessary, because God is omnipotent and therefore he can do anything he chooses. And that includes redeeming us and providing us all the blessings without Jesus ascending to heaven. So it's not necessary from an ultimate perspective. But in terms of what God chose, it does have purposes, and you could say it's necessary in that sense. One of the things that Jesus says in the Gospel of John is that when he goes away, he's going to prepare a place for the disciples. He says, in my Father's house, there are many dwelling places. If it weren't so, I would have told you. So he's going to do something to get heaven ready for his followers. Also, he says it's profitable for you that I go, because if I don't, you won't receive the Holy Spirit. So the bestowal of the Holy Spirit by God's choice was contingent on Jesus being ascended into heaven. And so those are the two things that I'm aware of that we're told are to our benefit. That Jesus is going to get heaven ready for us, and that he's going to send the Holy Spirit to us. You could propose additional things, because we do know additional stuff about what Jesus is doing in heaven. We know that he is reigning in heaven, as St. Paul says, until all of his enemies are put under are made his footstool, and the last enemy to be destroyed is death. So you could propose that there are additional processes, like the defeat of all the powers opposed to Jesus, including ultimately death, that also are related to Jesus's ascension into heaven. It's a little more speculative in those cases, because Jesus doesn't just tell us, but you could speculate about those things if you want, and so feel free.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Esmeralda, for that question. It's Internet Open Forum. This one comes from eRock5B. Some saints were said to have levitated.
Mm-hmm.
Will our resurrected bodies have abilities like levitation, telekinesis, etc.?
Okay, so it's true that various saints are reported to have levitated, and we actually have good evidence for that. There are some cases, like St. Joseph of Cupertino and St. Teresa of Avila, where we just have lots of witnesses. Right. Even in Thomas Aquinas's case, we have a few witnesses, but with like Joseph of Cupertino, he was levitating all the time. There were tons of witnesses, and we have statements from him. In fact, Joseph of Cupertino and St. Teresa of Avila were both investigated by inquisitions to see if they were faking. And so we have, expert witness testimony and things like that from people who saw them levitate in and could describe the way it happened. In terms of will our resurrected bodies have such abilities? Well, we're not told. So, I can't say for 100%, but the common theological opinion, and this would be my hope and expectation, is that we will have those abilities also. One way I could support that is by noting that Jesus levitated. He ascended into heaven. We're told that. That was our previous question. And we're told in the New Testament that in the resurrection, we're going to be like Jesus. So if he was able to levitate in glorious form, I would expect, I can't prove, but I would expect that we would be able to do the same thing. So that deals with eRock 5B's question about levitation. He also asked about telekinesis. Telekinesis is, for people who may not be familiar, is a reference to the ability to paranormally control matter with the mind. It's often called mind over matter. This term actually is not used really these days in parapsychology. Instead, the preferred term is psychokinesis. Psyche in Greek means mind, and kinesis means motion. So psychokinesis or psychokinesis would be mentally caused motion. Telekinesis, tele means distant, like in television, distant vision, or telephone, distant sound. And one of the things that parapsychologists have found is psychokinesis doesn't always operate at a distance. Sometimes you're doing it close up. You might be having an effect. This is known as micropsychokinesis or psychokinesis on the small scale, but you might be affecting the operation of an electronic device you're holding in your hand. That's still mind over matter. It's still psychokinesis, but it's not a distant object because it's right there in your hand. So that's just a terminological note. But you'll note that levitation is itself a form of psychokinesis. You're mentally manipulating the body so that it rises up off the ground. And so given that we would assuming we have levitation, it would, and can levitate our own bodies, it would be a logical extension of that to propose that we'll also have the ability to manipulate matter mentally. Now, can't say that for 100%, because we're making an additional inference here, and every time you make an additional inference, the confidence level goes down because it's an additional layer of speculation. But I would say it's a reasonable speculation.
All right, eRock5B, thank you very much for the question. We are marching through these questions today. Well, you are, Jimmy. This one comes from myalt-x2h. What if the Pope breaks the seal of confession? Is he excommunicated? Who would he be excommunicated from?
Okay, so now, God forbid the Pope or any priest should ever break the seal of confession, but if it happens, it carries with it an automatic penalty of excommunication. And so if the Pope broke the seal of confession, he would be excommunicated and would incur the penalties of that, which I'll talk about in a minute. Excommunication, though, is not a separation from the church. This is a common misunderstanding. Excommunication has a number of effects legally, but being kicked out of the church is actually not one of them. So the Pope would not be excommunicated from any person as the head of the church. He wouldn't be kicked out of the church. I assume that's what's going on in the background of the question. Mm-hmm. If you're thinking of excommunication as being separated from the church, and the Pope being in communion with the Pope is how you're in the church, who would he separate from? If he was excommunicated, that wouldn't make any sense. And you're right, it wouldn't make any sense, but that's not one of the effects of excommunication. There are two types of excommunication that are provided for in the Code of Canon Law. One of them is called late sententiae excommunication. That gets commonly glossed in English as automatic excommunication. And the other is known as ferende sententiae excommunication, which gets glossed in English as imposed excommunication. And they have different effects. If someone is excommunicated late sententiae, or automatically, which is the kind of excommunication provided for by breaking the seal, then they're not supposed to do things like place acts of governance until they get their situation remedied. So they're not supposed to make laws or give orders or make administrative decisions. They're supposed to chill until they get their excommunication lifted. But here's the thing. They are still allowed to do so. They're not supposed to, but they still can, unless the excommunication has been declared ferende sententiae, or unless it's been imposed. So what would happen if the Pope broke the seal of confession, is he would get automatic excommunication, and he would be in a state where he's not supposed to be governing the church, but he still can govern the church. And there wouldn't be a ferende sententiae excommunication, because it would involve judging the Pope, and under canon law, no one is allowed to judge the Pope. So you couldn't impose this excommunication. So he would be able to, he'd still be a member of the church. He'd still be able to govern the church. What he really should do is chill on the governing stuff and repent and get the excommunication lifted, which he could do himself. But just answering the question in terms of how it's posed, that would be the answer.
Oh, all right. Thank you very much. Now I got to remember who that was. That was my Alt-X2H, and it's such a beautiful name. I don't want to get it wrong. We're returning now to Humble Servant 0707. Is the war in Israel/Hamas prophesied in the Bible?
Absolutely not. There is a tendency on the part of folks today, anytime anything notable happens in Israel, to wonder if it's prophesied in the Bible. And the answer is no. There's basically no explicit prophecy, or very little explicit prophecy, about the modern state of Israel. There is so little that it's not even clear to Jewish scholars if the modern state of Israel is mentioned at all in the Bible. So now in the New Testament, which includes books that Jewish scholars don't recognize as canonical, Jesus is asked a question at the beginning of Acts, where Peter says to him, "Are you going to at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" Because they were under Roman rule at the time, and they had an expectation that at some point God would give them their nation back. They'd have home rule again. And Jesus says, it's not for you to know the times that God has determined. You need to focus on your task. But he doesn't reject the idea that Israel will one day again be its own entity with its own rule, not under some other nation's authority. And so you could propose that the modern state of Israel reflects a fulfillment of a prophecy along these lines, that, they got their land back, they're not under anybody else's authority. So maybe the expectation that the disciples had, that Jesus didn't reject, constitutes a kind of prophecy of one day Israel will get its land back and be able to rule itself. On the other hand, you could challenge that, because you could say, well, yeah, they got their land back, but now they're a secular state. They're not ruled by a king. They're ruled in an entirely secular way, and so maybe this is something that was not prophecy. Maybe this is just an accident of history. However you look at that question, there is absolutely nothing about Hamas in the Bible. Hamas is a modern terrorist organization, and it is completely absent from the Bible. Therefore, the current dust-up between Israel and Hamas, or Israel and Hezbollah on their northern front, neither of those is mentioned in the Bible. So we should not attribute prophetic significance to them.
Thanks, humble servant. Thanks very much. Dust-up is one of the great American coinages. That's we invented that, and I'm very proud of us for that. Yeah. I think we got time to do Census Fidelium 9510's question. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's an Ask Me Anything. I'd like to know the church's view on the union dock worker strike. Is it okay to stop working in this situation? What roles does the union play in society?
The church does not have any kind of teaching on the union dock worker strike that happened. In terms of the role of unions in society, well, basically they're collective bargaining agencies, and the church, recognizes a right of people to organize for negotiation. That right is not absolute, but it recognizes that people can organize if they feel that's the best way to arrive at a good settlement for them and their group. And is it okay to stop work in this situation? Well, I'm not a student of the union dock strike, so I don't know what their grievances were or what they were trying to achieve. But it is in principle legitimate to say at some point, work is a negotiation. And if you're not going to meet my demands, I'm not going to do work for you. So both sides, at which point the owner of a business may say, okay, I'll find someone else and I'm not going to meet your demands. You're welcome to stop work. On the other hand, if he doesn't want to lose the labor, then when the labor says, if you don't meet our demands, we're going to stop work. Well, if you don't want them to stop and if you don't want to have to replace them with someone else, then you will need to meet their demands, or both sides will need to move at least a little bit and meet in the middle somewhere.
Census Fidelium, thanks very much for the question. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's an Ask Me Anything. All the questions this hour and next have come from the internet. We get lots of internet questions. More of them for Jimmy Akin right after this on Catholic Answers Live. What was the church like in its infancy? In a word, Catholic. And Joe Heschmeyer has the receipts. In his best-selling book, The Early Church Was the Catholic Church, he gives you the details from the historical records of the first 2 centuries of Christianity. Right now, get a copy for just $10, plus free shipping if you live in the continental United States. Get more information and order The Early Church Was the Catholic Church at theearlychurchwascatholic.com.
Is orthodoxy an alternative to the Catholic Church? In a time of uncertainty for many Catholics, orthodoxy can look like greener pastures. Answering Orthodoxy, the new book from Catholic Answers Press, explains why Catholics who are thinking of leaving need to think twice. There are important reasons to remain in the Catholic Church and convincing answers to Orthodox claims. Order your copy of Answering Orthodoxy today at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Is the Catholic faith still a rock amidst the waves of history? Why does it so often seem to be a mess? In his latest book, Confusion in the Kingdom, best-selling author Trent Horn helps you to get to the roots of the present chaos, explaining the destabilizing movements within Catholicism and exposing the harm and scandal progressive Catholicism has caused. Order your copy of Confusion in the Kingdom today at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore.
Our Lord needs articulate defenders of the truth to spread the joy of the Catholic faith. Catholic Answers monthly giving club, Society 315, helps you fulfill the call in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. For as little as $10 a month, you'll help Catholics grow in faith, bring lapsed Catholics home, and lead non-Catholics to the truth. Go to casociety315.com and join today.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live, All Saints Day version, and all the questions today for Jimmy Akin are internet questions. They've all come to us one way or another through those electronic means, and Jimmy gathers them up for us, and then I get to ask him the questions on the air. I mentioned earlier Jimmy has a podcast, the Jimmy Akin podcast. Can you tell us just about the podcast and maybe what people could find this week over on the Jimmy Akin podcast?
So the Jimmy Akin podcast is focused on apologetics, or broadly understood. It'll cover theology and biblical studies and stuff like that. It's more like what I do here on Catholic Answers Live than it is what I do on Mysterious World. The tagline for it is that we, on the Jimmy Akin podcast, we discuss the mysteries of the faith. So it's faith-based content particularly. It's different than what I do here on Catholic Answers Live, though, in a couple of respects. One of them is I can go a little longer than I can when I'm answering a brief radio call-in question. And secondly, it's pre-scripted. So I can do my research, I can add graphics and things like that to help illustrate what I'm talking about. So I don't have to do it just all off the top of my head the way I do here. So it's faith-based. I'm allowed to do more in-depth answers than I can here on Catholic Answers Live, and I'm able to add things to them, add things to those answers that I can't really do here on Catholic Answers Live. And in terms of what dropped this week, it's guaranteed to come out on Mondays. We may also have bonus episodes later in the week, but it's always coming out on Monday. And this last Monday, we had a video drop on what I call the Jonah death hypothesis. There have been a number of people lately in Catholic circles who have been maintaining that Jonah died in the whale and was dead for 3 days and then rose from the dead. And that's a more exact parallel to Jesus than what Christians have historically supposed. So in this week's episode, I talk about the Jonah death hypothesis and why it's catastrophically wrong. I first go through the arguments favoring the Jonah death hypothesis that its advocates make, and I show that they don't carry force. And then I review the book of Jonah and the whale's function in the book of Jonah. And I reveal that the Jonah death hypothesis fundamentally misunderstands what the whale is doing in the book of Jonah. The whale has a very specific function, and its function is not for Jonah to be dead inside of it. In fact, it's the whale that saves Jonah from drowning. Yeah. So you can check that out and find out what the arguments are in favor of the Jonah death hypothesis and why the whole thing is colossally wrong.
Still, I feel like after 3 days you would need such a shower. I mean, how gross.
Oh, I'm not disputing that.
I mean, even if it's like Geppetto and what was the guy's name? Pinocchio. Do you remember Pinocchio and Geppetto in the whale? Still 3 days in a whale. Come on. All right, check it out. Well, first of all, you can check it out on YouTube. It's all that content is on YouTube, but you can also find it wherever you find your favorite podcast, the Jimmy Akin podcast. Another question from eRock5B. After the bodily resurrection, do we live in heaven, the new earth, or some combination of the two?
The answer that's presented in the book of Revelation, and it's based on earlier passages like from the book of Isaiah, but specifically in Revelation, it depicts resurrected humanity as living on the new earth, which is united with the new heaven. So the separation of heaven and earth that we experience now is not envisioned to continue into the future. So that's what Revelation presents us with. We're going to be on the new earth, which will be united with the new heaven. So it's really a combination of both.
All right, eRock5B, thank you very much for the question. This question comes from Blind Owl John 70. I feel like if your name is Blind Owl John, you better be able to play saxophone or slide guitar or something.
Harmonica.
Yeah, but you better have some kind of a cool instrument that you can play. All right, Blind Owl John 75 wants to know this. Hi, Jimmy. Why were there guards stationed at the tomb of Jesus if Jews only believed in resurrection at the end of the world? Doesn't this imply that the Jewish authorities at least thought Jesus' followers believed Jesus could rise from the dead? Do you think his disciples believed he would rise after 3 days?
Well, okay, so we got a few questions here. The first one is that we probably ought to address is, did Jews believe that the dead would be raised only at the end of the world? And broadly speaking, the answer is yes. It was not a broad Jewish expectation that there would be a resurrection prior to the end of the world. Having said that, Jesus predicted that he would rise in 3 days, and the Jewish authorities knew that. By the way, not all of the Jewish authorities would have believed in resurrection to begin with, because some of them were Sadducees, like the high priest Caiaphas, and they didn't believe in an afterlife. They thought when you die, you're just worm food. So they not all of them believed in the resurrection, even at the end of the world, but they knew that Jesus had said he would rise in 3 days. And that didn't mean that they thought the disciples believed he would rise in 3 days. They may have conjectured that, but what they're actually afraid of, according to Matthew, is that the disciples are going to come and steal the body and so he won't be raised in 3 days, but his disciples, based on his statement that he would be raised in 3 days, might steal the body and then try to pass it off as if he had been raised from the dead. And consequently, and then they say, and the latter deception will be worse than the former. So what they're trying to stop is the disciples stealing the body. And that would mean at least the core disciples knew he was not going to be raised. Otherwise, why bother stealing the body? So they're not envisioning the disciples or the core disciples believing he's going to rise, but that they're going to use Jesus's statement from when he was alive to pull a hoax on people. The last question then is, do I think Jesus believed he would rise after 3 days? So that's in the future. And the answer we get from the Gospels is no. In none of the Gospels do we have anybody who's expecting the resurrection. The women who find the tomb empty are not expecting the resurrection. They're going there to anoint Jesus's body with spices. When they then report the resurrection to the core disciples, the males, they're not initially believed, and then even when the women, come and make the initial report, they think that, someone like a gardener maybe has moved Jesus's body. So they don't think he's been raised. And then when Jesus himself actually shows up, the disciples interpret him as a ghost. Mm-hmm. That's their fallback position. So they still, his spirit is here, but they don't think it's his body until he lets them handle him and he eats food in front of them and stuff like that. So their first hypothesis is they think he's in the tomb. When that turns out not to be true, their second hypothesis is they think somebody moved the body. And then when that turns out not to be true, they think he's a ghost. That's their third hypothesis. So it's not until we get to the fourth hypothesis that they conclude he really has been raised. And that's a testament to how strong the belief in resurrection on the last day only was in Jewish circles, that they burn through three other hypotheses before they arrive at the truth.
Blind Al John, thanks very much for the question. This one comes from Adam I4H8D. Am I supposed to put that together into some kind of... No. Adam I4H8D. All right. Jimmy Akin, do you think that Jesus received any grace when he ate the Eucharist? I know he is the source of grace, but he was strengthened by an angel in the agony in the garden. Curious to hear your thoughts on what's happening in both of these instances on a metaphysical or ontological level.
Okay, so the first thing to say is I don't know that Jesus received communion at the Last Supper because it doesn't say he did. He may have, but what it says is that he took bread and broke it and gave it to the disciples and told them to eat it. And similarly, it says that he took the cup and gave it to them and told them to drink it. So it's not for 100% based on the text that I could say he definitely took communion. I believe he did. I just couldn't prove it, so I want to note that. But assuming he did, could he receive grace? Well, in his divine nature, he is the source of grace, and thus has infinite sanctifying grace in his divine nature. The question is about his human nature. Could he have received great additional grace in his human nature? And here, I would say the answer is yes, and I would point to Adam's own reference to how he was strengthened by an angel during the agony of the garden. He was also ministered to by angels during the temptation in the wilderness, and so that shows us that his physical form, as part of his human nature, had highs and lows in terms of strength, and so he could be strengthened by angels. He could be weakened by fasting for 40 days, or he could be weakened in his human nature by the agony of knowing what was going to be coming upon him in a few hours. So we see ups and downs in levels of strength. And if we see that, then I think the same thing could be true of sanctifying grace. Now, Jesus will never be weakened in sanctifying grace, because in order to get rid of sanctifying grace, you have to commit sin, and Jesus never did that. But I would say that he could have additional amounts of sanctifying grace poured into his human nature. At least I can imagine that happening. And so if he did receive the Eucharist, and the Eucharist normally conveys sanctifying grace, then I could see Jesus's human nature acquiring additional sanctifying grace beyond that which it already had. Having said that, this is a speculative area. The church doesn't have a teaching here as far as I'm aware, and so people could hold different opinions on this.
Adam, thank you. Brought us right up to the break, but thank you very much for the question. Lots more questions to come. It's Ask Me Anything, Internet Variety with Jimmy Akin today on Catholic Answers Live.
Hello, this is Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone of San Francisco. Keep your dial tuned to Catholic Answers Live.
In Morse code, the sequence SOS is a distress call. It's been said that it stands for Save Our Souls. Well, right now our world is in big trouble, and we're putting out an SOS call for help. Will you answer that call? St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, has hundreds of teams who share the good news with souls who don't know Jesus. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization. Visit streetevangelization.com to get involved.
EWTN Radio posts 11 podcasts every weekday and over 60 per week. They're the perfect companion for busy Catholics everywhere. With on-demand access to audio, you can pause and pick up right where you left off anytime, anywhere. And they're all free. Subscribe by going to EWTNradio.net, then click on podcasts. They're waiting for you. EWTN is the global Catholic network.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin, our guest, both hours today on this Feast of All Saints in the Catholic Church. We're awful glad you're here with us on the feast day. And then this next question comes from Cristobal Gomez Gutierrez, 8546. And here's the question. Are there instructions or limits to cursing? My intuition is that it is bad. But Jesus did curse a fig tree and said, "Woe to whom betrayed him." Was it okay because he's God? Furthermore, would it be bad to curse a war, and what would be the effect? God bless you and the reader. I'm the reader, so thank you very much, Cristobal.
Okay, so the first thing I'll mention is I actually have an episode of Mysterious World where I talk about curses. It's episode 126. So you can go to mysterious.fm/126 and listen to that for more background. But in terms of cursing, the first thing we've got to do is discuss what type of cursing we're talking about, because the term gets used in colloquial English to refer to more than the classical understanding of cursing. The classical understanding is you say something bad about a person or thing in hopes of that bad thing coming true. So like, to quote Johnny Carson's The Great Karnak, may your armpits be filled with a million fleas. Mm-hmm. That would be a curse. A lot of what we think of as cursing today, like particularly when you hear people talking about cussing, because cussing is just an alternate pronunciation of cursing. They think it means using bad words like bathroom words or things like that. And that is not cussing. That is not cursing, properly speaking. That's vulgarity. Vulgarity is using the language of common men. Common men or vulgar people use bad language, and that's vulgarity, but it's not profanity, which is desecrating holy things, and it's not cursing, which is wishing ill on someone. Well, okay, Jesus did curse a fig tree. And he did so really to make a point. He was doing an object lesson. He found the fig tree, and you can determine this by looking, for example, at how it's treated in Mark. Mark is known for having sequences of material that are referred to as Markan sandwiches, where he'll take one part of a story and then he'll have an interruption in the story, and then he'll have the second part of the story, and that's called a Markan sandwich. And what you do in a Markan sandwich is you relate the framing story that's at the beginning and the end to the central part of the story that's different. So in Mark, the earliest version of this we have, Jesus finds the fig tree. It's putting on a big show. It's got leaves, which suggests that even though the time for mature figs isn't here yet, it should have on it these kind of proto figs that figs put out. But he doesn't find anything. It's all show. It's just a bunch of leaves. And so he curses it and says, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. Then he goes to the temple and clears it. And then they come back and see the fig tree withered. So the two parts of the fig tree narrative are functioning as a commentary on the temple narrative and the cleansing of the temple. So Jesus goes to the temple. It's putting on a big show. We got a great temple to worship God here, but they're corrupting it with selling stuff where people are supposed to be allowed to pray and stuff like that. That's why he refers to the statement in the Old Testament that my house is meant to be a house of prayer for the nations. Well, there was a court of the Gentiles where Gentiles could come and pray to God, but they were filling it up with buyers and sellers. So they were, in other words, putting on a big religious show here, but they didn't have any spiritual fruit to present. And consequently, the cursing of the fig tree serves as an enacted parable of the cursing of the temple and how the temple is ultimately going to be destroyed. So in cursing the fig tree, basically Jesus destroyed an inanimate object in order to teach a spiritual lesson. It'd be kind of like getting a chainsaw and cutting the tree down. He could have done that too, and that would have made the point as well. So it's not that he curses it is the issue. He's got a reason for doing it, and it's just an inanimate object. It therefore can be destroyed for an important purpose, like teaching a spiritual lesson, whether you do that with a curse or whether you do that with a chainsaw. When it comes to him saying woe to the one who betrays him, woe is not itself, it's not necessarily a curse. Woe is just an expression of misfortune. And it can even be an expression of sympathy. Something bad has happened to this person. So if you say woe to this person, you're not adding to their woe, you're expressing their woe. And so I wouldn't view that as necessarily a curse. You could read it as one if he was somehow adding to Judas's punishment, but that's not the sense I get from the text. He's not adding to Judas's sentence. He's just expressing some really unfortunate stuff is going to happen to the person who betrays me. When it comes to, are there instructions or limits to cursing? Well, this has actually been discussed. There's not really a church teaching here, so different theologians can have different opinions. But if you look in the Summa Theologiae, St. Thomas Aquinas has a whole section on cursing, and he notes properly that curses themselves have no effect. So you mentioned what would happen if you cursed a war. What would be the effect? Well, there wouldn't be any effect just from the fact you say, dang this war. Mm-hmm. Curses only have effect if someone with power acts on the curse. Now, so who could act on a curse? Well, it could be a demon, but we're not supposed to have any dealings with them. So have no truck with demons. Don't mess with them. It could be an angel, if God assigns the angel to act on a curse, or it could be God himself who acts on the curse. So if you can find a curse that corresponds to the will of God, it would not be sinful to pronounce it. and God could make it effective. But you got to be really careful in doing that. And St. Thomas Aquinas talks about that. You don't just go around cursing people or things for no reason. If you've got a reason that corresponds to the will of God, then you could curse. But in general, you don't have such reasons. And in general, you want to take the attitude that Jesus recommends, which is bless those who persecute you rather than curse them. Say good things about them and ask God to give them good things, even though they're doing bad stuff to you. We want a universal ethic of love where we try to help everybody. Now, that's not to say there may not be situations where a curse would be warranted, but it is to say, like, if, just like we want to love everybody, we don't want to have to shoot people dead. But if a murderer breaks into your home and is at the point of killing your family, you could shoot him dead as part of legitimate self-defense. And in the same way, we want a universal ethic of love where we bless people and don't curse them. That's not to say there are no imaginable situations where a curse could be warranted, but it is to say they're very exceptional.
All right. Thank you, Cristobal, very much for the question. This one comes from Bobby Johnson, 6410. When death occurs suddenly, and the incident is faster than the brain can comprehend, as in the case of a submarine implosion, does God give a grace of awareness to the victim, or is it possible for the soul to be confused at the judgment seat of Christ?
Well, we're not told the answer to this in Scripture. So we have to, if we want to try to get any data about this, we have to look at extra scriptural evidence, like what it can be gleaned from near-death experiences that people have. When Bobby says, does God give a grace of awareness to the victim? What he means is an instant grace of awareness, because it could be that the soul could be confused, and then when it goes before Jesus at the judgment seat, then it learns, oh, okay, you're dead, and now it's time for judgment. So what he's imagining is an instant awareness of the fact that I'm dead. And the evidence we have from near-death experiences suggests that the answer to that is no, that there are situations where people report being confused about whether they're dead or alive. And it can take, so they're not given an instant awareness. They will eventually learn that, okay, you're dead and now we have some stuff to deal with, but it appears it is not necessarily instantaneous. And so some people can be confused, at least for a period of time, once they have died, about exactly what happened to them and the fact they are dead. So it appears from the data we have, which is all extra biblical, that there's not an immediate instant enlightenment about all of these things, and there is a learning process that can still be required in the afterlife, or at least the early afterlife.
That's when you might want to rely on the old guardian angel for some help there. Wow, that's such a great question. We've never had that question on the show before. At least that I remember. That's a wonderful question, Bobby. Thank you. So many wonderful questions from folks. And Jimmy Akin here to answer them all, not just this hour, but next hour as well. Today is All Saints Day, the Feast of All Saints. It is the day when we remember all the saints in the Catholic Church. It's a holy day. We go to Mass today. And so all of our questions are already in. They have come to us via the internet. If you're just catching us.
Are you vamping to get to the end of the hour, or are you going to ask me the next question?
No, I'm not going to ask you. I'm going to get to the end of the hour.
Okay, vamp away then.
There's like 14 seconds. I mean, I could, but it seemed like
I'm just trying to know what to expect. So
yeah. Well, let me think this through. How would I vamp if I wanted to vamp? I would probably say, "Let me think this through. How would I vamp if I wanted to vamp all the way to the end of the hour?"
Oh, Jimmy, you're getting recursive now.
Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's Ask Me Anything, but it's an Ask Me Anything of the internet variety. All the questions are already in. We've already had a whole bunch of great ones. We've got a bunch of great ones to come. If you don't know who we are, you can go to Catholic.com and find out all about what we do. We're devoted just to what we're doing right here, answering questions, explaining and defending the Catholic faith. Also, you can visit Jimmy Akin's podcast just wherever you get your podcasts. Go to the Jimmy Akin podcast. Just search for Jimmy Akin podcast wherever you get your podcast and you'll find it. Or find Mysterious World at mysterious.fm. We'll be right back with lots more questions for Jimmy Akin after this. And no more vamping on Catholic Answers Live. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Happy Feast of All Saints to you. Jimmy Akin, our guest. All the questions coming from the internet. And last time we had a question, I was just telling Jimmy this at the break, where the part of the person's identity was I4H8D. And I thought, I was reading it like you try to, when you try to read a license plate.
A rebus.
Is that, okay, now explain. Of course you've got a vocabulary word for it. What's a rebus? What does that mean?
A rebus is a message that is written partly in letters and partly in symbols. So like if there's a symbol of a bee, the animal that
bee
flies around and makes honey,
right?
You could treat it as in a rebus as part of the verb be.
Oh yeah.
So a rebus is typically a mix of letters and symbols. Sometimes they're really complex, but to quote Hemlock Stones, sometimes it's just a simple rebus. Any simple English schoolboy could catch it.
Well, that's what I was like, is that a rebus? Like, am I supposed to know what this is? But I don't know. I like there's a lot of stuff that goes on now, memes and all these. I'm like,
leet speak.
Somebody
is
gets
a modern
it.
version.
What's it called?
Leet speak.
Leet speak? What does that mean?
Yeah, leet speak is it's like an internet rebus where you mix typically letters and numbers. So like you would spell leet L33T.
Oh yes, that's what I thought it was. Right.
It's short for elite speak. If you're one of the elite, you know how to read this kind of stuff. And it arose among gamers and so forth. But in the string I4H8D, H8D could be leet speak for hated.
That's what
But I don't know what I4 hated means.
I know that. Okay. All right. Good. I hate when somebody has the license plate that you're supposed to be able to decipher and I can't decipher it. I feel like I'm just trying to go to the grocery store and now I am baffled by your stupid thing. It's going to bother me all day that I can't decipher your license plate. All right, back to questions we go. We got a lot of questions from the internet for Jimmy this hour. And this one comes from Keith Lewis, 8949, which I'm pretty sure is just an actual name. Do you think God speaks to you?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by speaks. Now, there's a spectrum of different ways in which God could communicate with someone. And sort of at the top of that spectrum is God communicating to you, or at least close to the top of it, is God communicating to you in audible words where you hear a divine voice. That's what's known as a locution. And then kind of a step down from that is not where you hear an audible voice, but you hear like a mental voice. So it still comes in the form of words, but you know that I'm not hearing it with my ears. I'm hearing it with my mind. And then a step down from that would be having a strong intuition about something where it doesn't come in words, but the content, the informational content is still communicated and still clearly, something beyond the normal thought processes you would have. And then a step down from that would be being able to deduce messages from God. And then a step down from that would be being able to deduce messages, but not on a regular basis, but like looking at the broad strokes of your life history and being able to deduce from that what God would want you to know. And then a step below that, it gets progressively grayer as you go down. So God does not speak to me with an audible voice. God does not speak to me with a mental voice. He could do either one of those. He just hadn't so far as I know. When it comes to having strong intuitions, well, I do sometimes have strong intuitions, but I don't know that they're coming from God. They might be coming from me, or they might be coming from elsewhere. A step below that of deducing things, some people talk about getting a lot of deductions from God about their life. I knew they do something that I refer to as theologizing their life. Like I used to know a woman who did a lot of theologizing of her life. She would say, God is teaching me this right now, and God is teaching me this right now, based on things that were happening to her in her daily life. And I was always suspicious of that. I mean, I didn't challenge her, because God works differently with different folks, and maybe she is correctly discerning lessons from God based on little individual incidents that are happening to her. But I would not feel so confident in my own ability to make those deductions. I tend to think that I can look at the broad strokes of my life history and figure out things from God based on that. So if that's what you mean by does God speak to me, I would say yes. In looking at the broad strokes of my life history, I can deduce certain lessons that I think God wants me to learn. Most of the time, though, if I'm looking at very recent incidents and, little narrow things, I think there's a lot of noise in the system that prevents me from being able to make lots of quick individual deductions. I have to kind of take the long view and make deductions. So what I tend to do is I don't really look for divine voices or divine messages in every little incident. Instead, what I do is I say to God, I'm going to do the best I can and trust you to guide me along the way, even if I'm not aware of you guiding me. And so that's how I tend to relate to God.
Keith, thank you. What a great question. Appreciate that. It's an internet open forum. Ask Me Anything. Jimmy Akin, our guest. This one comes from Sighthound Lady, 15. I'm actively reading and studying my Bible, and one of my top concerns is if the Jewish people were given adequate chance to believe that Jesus was God and that his teachings were true. Obviously, the Jewish people have continued on, and is that not what God wanted? Any discussion on the topic would be appreciated. Thank you, Jimmy and his team. We're the team. That's us. We're included.
Yeah.
All right, Darren.
Yeah.
You and me. Zach.
Okay, so I would say that the Jewish people were given an adequate chance to believe that Jesus is God, but that has to be understood with some nuance. In the first place, there was, and this comes as a surprise to many individuals today, both Jewish and Christian, there was an awareness in Second Temple Judaism, which is when Jesus lived, of a concept known as the two powers in heaven doctrine. This was a part of, it was considered a legitimate Jewish opinion. It was not shared by all Jews, but it was part of the Jewish religious culture at the time, the belief that in addition to Yahweh, the God up in heaven, there's also a second divine figure up there, someone who's also somehow God, who is called the lesser Yahweh in some texts. And Jesus identifies himself with that lesser Yahweh, who is also known as the Son of Man. So it was a little easier for people to believe. Now, later, the rabbis got rid of this concept. But in Jesus's own day, this concept was on the table. And so that made it a little easier for some Jews to recognize Jesus as divine. Some Jews obviously accepted his claim. They were the first generation of Christians. Some Jews did not accept his claim in a way where it looks like they're at fault, like Caiaphas, for example, the high priest who puts him to death. Looks like Caiaphas has a bad conscience in this matter, and other Jewish leaders could too. In terms of the Jewish people continuing, well, non-Christian Jews have definitely continued, but there's some evidence that actually most Jews became Christian in later centuries. The population in the Roman world of Jews to non-Jews was something like 10%. Something like 10% of the people in the Roman world were Jews. Well, today, Jews are not 10% of the population in Europe or the Americas. Judaism is, in fact, there's only like 16 million Jews in the world. The Jewish population, globally speaking, and of course this includes people in Africa and the Americas and Asia that they didn't know about back then, but it's only 0.2%. So of the global population is Jewish. What it looks like, though, and I've seen historians argue this, is that the Christian mission to the Jews was broadly successful. Most Jews did become Christian over the next few centuries. What about those, though, who were not at fault, like Caiaphas, but who also either didn't hear the Christian message or didn't become Christian through no fault of their own? Well, God knows that. If you're not a Christian, if you don't believe Jesus is God through no fault of your own, God knows it's not your fault, and He's not gonna hold you accountable for it. So, for things that aren't your fault, so it's still possible for people like that to be saved. God did want the Jewish people to continue as an ethnic identity. In fact, St. Paul discusses that in the book of Romans, and he indicates that prior to the second coming, there will be a large-scale corporate conversion of Jewish people to the Christian faith. And that presupposes that there were continuing non-Christian Jews during that time period. And Paul says, even though they're enemies of yours for the sake of the gospel, they're still beloved on account of their forefathers. So God had made promises to the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And even if a Jew was not a Christian, they still were God was still fulfilling his promises to them, and they were continuing to benefit from that relationship with God, even if it's not a complete or perfect or even an individually saving relationship. But what we can be confident of is God treats everybody, God loves everybody. He treats everybody fairly. And if you have not been given a presentation sufficient to convince you in good faith to believe in Jesus, then God can still work with you in spite of that and can still bring you to himself in the afterlife in heaven.
Sighthound Lady, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful question. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's Ask Me Anything, internet variety. We'll continue with that right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Catholic Answers Live.
Do you have a question but prefer to ask it privately? Catholic Questions can help. Go to CatholicQuestions.com to ask your question online, email us, drop us a letter, or give us a call. Longtime Catholic Answers Live apologist and author Jim Blackburn or another Catholic Questions apologist will be happy to assist you. Catholic Questions proudly supports Catholic Answers Live, so visit us at CatholicQuestions.com today. That's CatholicQuestions.com.
Another great podcast on EWTN Podcast Central is Way of the Fathers. It's a podcast about the fathers and doctors of the Church, the foundational figures of Christian history, hosted by Dr. Jim Papandrea. You can hear this and other faith-filled podcasts from our friends and affiliates around the world at EWTN Podcast Central. Visit EWTN.com/radio and click on Podcast Central today.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin is our guest. Jimmy is senior apologist here at Catholic Answers. You're always hearing me giving away a couple of his books. The Bible is a Catholic book. We give away a lot, and very often you hear me give away a daily defense, 365 days plus one to becoming a better apologist. I especially like to give that book to people who say, I'm a catechist, or I'm working in the RCIA or OCIA, or those kind of teachers. Just a wonderful resource with 366 questions that get asked about that, sometimes challenges that are made to the Catholic faith, and then one-page answers. But also you'll hear, but sometimes I give away the book, The Words of Eternal Life, True Happiness and Where to Find It, especially for people who are kind of seeking. But Jimmy's got lots of great books in addition to the podcasts that we've already talked about. You can find them over at shop.catholic.com or wherever you get your good Catholic books.
Welcome to Books I Have Given Away by Cy Kelly.
I know. I do give away a lot of your books, however. And I am enjoying the names today. I don't know. I'm enjoying the questions very much. I do feel, as I said to you at the break, I feel like these are great questions today. But the names have been good as well. And this one comes from Obliviax1112. And Obliviax asks, Good evening, Jimmy from the UK. I have a question about the sacrament of confession. In the Old Testament, people brought animal sacrifices to the priest to atone for their sins, with the size of the sacrifice corresponding to the severity of the sin, if I remember rightly. This is mirrored in the early church as confession was a public act, where individuals admitted their sins before the entire congregation. However, this practice evolved into the private one-on-one confessions we know today, largely due to the influence of Irish monks, who introduced this method in the early medieval period. Some have argued that because the form of confession has changed over time, the seal of confession could also be altered. How can I explain this development to non-Catholics and some Catholics too? Thank you, Jimmy. May God continue to bless and guide you all.
Well, thank you, Obliviax. And since you said good evening to us from the UK, good afternoon from Arkansas, and from Cy Kellett's perspective, good morning from California. So you're right that in the Old Testament, there were sacrifices to deal with sin, principally animal sacrifices. We don't actually have evidence, at least good convincing evidence, that the size of the animal sacrifice corresponded to the severity of the sin. What we find with some of the sacrifices, there's several different types of sacrifices they had, and even though several of them could deal with sin, we're not 100% sure which sacrifices went with sin and in what way. There's information we don't have about how the ancient sacrificial system worked. What we do have in the case of some sacrifices is a graded scale, not based on the severity of the sin, but on the wealth of the offerer. So like if you're a king, you're a rich dude, guess what? You're given a bull. But if you're an ordinary farmer, you're not rich, you might give a lamb. Or if you're poor, you might give a bird, or potentially even a grain offering in substitution for an animal. So the gradation that you're referring to, at least in terms of what we can demonstrate, is not so much tied to the severity of the sin, but to the wealth of the offerer of the sacrifice. In terms of the shifting of how confession is administered, well, it is true that there has been a development, and there was originally more more public confession in the early church, and one-on-one confession was promoted by Irish monks in the early centuries, but even before private confession became the norm, which it is today, there was private confession happening in the early church. We have records of it, even before it was the norm. And I quote some in The Fathers Know Best, I quote some people talking about that. But you're right that the administration of the sacrament has developed, and one of the things that's developed is the seal of confession. If the church found by experience that people are much more willing to confess if they are given absolute assurance that the information is not going to go further. And so out of that, the seal of confession developed, which is essentially, legislation to ensure confidentiality. Now, could that change in the future? So why did that change is the first question. The answer was because the church discovered if you give people assurance of confidentiality, they will confess more. And that's what we want. We want people getting right with God. We want them to use this sacrament, and institute the seal of confession help them use this sacrament. So there was a rational basis for introducing this. Could it change in the future? Well, since the seal of confession is a product of merely ecclesiastical law, it's not part of divine law, the answer is yes, it could change in the future. Do I think it's likely to change in the future? No, not anytime in the foreseeable future. The church is very well convinced of the benefits of this, and I don't see any practical basis for that being revisited anytime in the future that I can foresee.
Obliviax, thank you for the question, and thanks for listening over there in the UK. We're glad you do. I hope we'll get to interact again sometime. This question comes from Duff Beer. Yep, that's the name the person gave.
And you know where Duff Beer is from?
The Simpsons.
The Simpsons, right.
Yeah. And I think they actually make Duff Beer. I think somebody made it in the real world. All right, Duff Beer. Duff Beer asks this. I've watched your Mysterious Worlds episode on young Earth, old Earth, and the flood, but would it be permissible for a Catholic to interpret Genesis as a poetic narrative describing God's creation of man and culling of the most evil men in our distant past by, 1, reading Adam and Eve being earlier hominids when our ancestors became able to reason instead of being driven by instinct, and in turn, after sinning against God by eating from a possibly metaphorical tree of knowledge, wow, this is a lot, our brain capacity started to expand, causing more difficult births. 2, reading the flood as being a story about God destroying more sinful versions of our ancestors, causing a population bottleneck as far back as 900,000 years ago. Okay, I'll continue. Converting to Catholicism from a secular background, reading the Old Testament as divinely inspired truths seen and expressed through a lens of contemporary culture, when each part of the Old Testament was written, removes all the stumbling blocks to finding my faith. But I don't know if my interpretation stretches what is written too far.
Okay, so we sort of have two issues there. The first one is the question, are these ideas permissible? And the second is, do these ideas stress the interpretation of the text too far? So let's deal with those independently. The first one, would it be permissible to read Genesis as a not fully literal narrative that understands Adam and Eve as early hominids, and it describing the process by which hominids the human line became more intelligent, resulting in more difficult births? Well, it's true that the rise of human intelligence is tied to difficulty in having birth, because we've got, compared to other creatures, we have freaky big craniums to house our ginormous oversized brains that help us think smart. And that means these huge craniums have to fit through the birth canal of a human woman, which is complicated by the fact that we walk on two legs, that we're bipedal. And so the rise of bipedalism and the rise of human intelligence, which are also linked because that freed up our hands to allow us to manipulate objects in our environment, and that also helped boost human intelligence. The rise of bipedalism and the rise of human intelligence both made for more difficult births, which is why, compared to other creatures, humans are born basically completely dependent on their parents for everything. You know, you look at other creatures, like let's say a baby deer. If you watch a mama deer giving birth, plop, out comes the baby deer, and within a few minutes it's running around. Mm-hmm. You know, because mama deer can't pick up the baby deer and carry it, and their lifestyle as deer is based on running away from things. That's their success strategy. Our success strategy is being smart. Their success strategy is running away from stuff. So little baby deer's got to be able to get up and run around really quick. But human babies come out, plop, and it can't do anything. For years it can't do anything. It's got to be carried by the parents. It can't eat on its own. It's got to be fed by the parents. Well, it's because we are going to end up so terrifically smart compared to other terrestrial creatures that that brain case has to fit through the birth canal of a bipedal woman, and that means that we've got to be born really early and undeveloped and helpless, and then we have to be cared for years. And not only can our kids not do anything for themselves, the one thing they can do is scream, and so they do. And they scream a phenomenal amount. I mean, evolutionary biologists talk about this. Our kids yell their heads off when they are small, way more than is even needed to get their basic needs met. Why does that happen? Because you look at other species like deer, do their kids yell their heads off? No. Other species, the kids, unless they're predators, the kids tend to be quiet because they don't want to attract attention from predators. Well, you could think the same thing could apply to humans because they're born helpless. They are prey waiting to be taken, except for the fact they've got their parents around to protect them. And their parents are super smart. And their parents will kick the butt of anything that tries to harm their babies. And so the fact our babies yell their heads off and annoy their parents so much is testimony to the fact that we own this rock. But there's more to say, and I'll say it on the other side of the break.
Duff Beer, thanks for the question. We will get to the rest of the answer right after this, and lots more questions to come. Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin continues on Catholic Answers Live. When the resurrected Jesus appeared to disciples on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize him until the breaking of the bread. The same is true today. In the Holy Eucharist, we really meet Jesus. In The Eucharist is Really Jesus, author Joe Heschmeyer explains how knowing Jesus in the Eucharist is the key to understanding all of Christian faith. Order your copy of The Eucharist is Really Jesus today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore.
Our Lord needs articulate defenders of the truth to spread the joy of the Catholic faith. Catholic Answers monthly giving club, Society 315, helps you fulfill the call in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. For as little as $10 a month, you'll help Catholics grow in faith, bring lapsed Catholics home, and lead non-Catholics to the truth. Go to casociety315.com and join today.
We hope that one of the things that we communicate here at Catholic Answers Live is that our Catholic faith allows us to be fully serious about all the problems we encounter in the church and in the world, but it also lets us have light hearts and maybe even mix in a bit of fun, and that is exactly what our good friend Joe Heschmeyer does in his popular podcast, Shameless Popery. You should check it out at shamelessjoe.com. Joe's got a deep grasp of the faith, morals, the teachings of the church, all that, but he's also got a witty conversational style. He entertains and he informs, but you will leave equipped to better answer the most common challenges, misconceptions, and questions about the Catholic faith. He's got insightful guests, he does on-air debates, and he takes a close look into all the things that you want to know about as a Catholic living today. You'll walk away knowledgeable and filled with joy. Look for Joe on his YouTube channel. Check him out at shamelessjoe.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, become a patron. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin is our guest. Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin this hour, and all the questions, however, have come from the internet. This one and people have very funny names that they use on the internet. This one comes from someone named Duff Beer, and it's a long question, Jimmy, so I maybe...
I'll summarize
Yeah,
it.
go ahead.
Yeah. So the chunk of the question I'm looking at is it permissible to understand Genesis as a narrative that treats Adam and Eve as being earlier hominins because they would be members of the species Homo, or the group of species Homo, when Adam and Eve's rise to intelligence, because they gain wisdom by eating from the tree of knowledge, and then Eve gets cursed with having painful childbirth. Could we read this as a narrative about how humans developed intelligence? Would that be permitted? Yes, it would. The idea that Adam and Eve were just two individuals is something the church has historically supported. It's been the default assumption down through history, but in the 20th century, there was a lot, and actually it predates the 20th century, but in the 20th century, there was a lot of discussion of this. And these days, I won't go through it blow by blow. I've done that before, and I can do that again in the future. But the magisterium is showing flexibility on whether Adam and Eve were two individuals, or whether they were a symbol, or whether they represent larger populations. But these days, all of those are permitted. So yes, you could propose this. The second part of the question was, would it be permissible to read the flood narrative as a story about God destroying more sinful versions of our ancestors, causing a population bottleneck as far back as 900,000 years ago? And the answer, again, would be yes. The church doesn't have any teachings that would prevent you from reading it that way. So you could understand both of these narratives in the ways you propose. But then there's the second half of the question, which is, do these interpretations stretch the text too far? And this is just a personal opinion. So the answer to the first two questions was, yeah, you can take them this way. But in regard to the second aspect of the question, does it stretch the interpretation of the text too far? I would say it does. I don't think it's likely that the author of Genesis would have traditions to compose the text that dated as far back as 900,000 years or even further in the case of the origins of humanity. I do believe there are traditions that can last for thousands of years, especially if the traditions are connected with basically permanent fixtures in our environments. Like, we have evidence that the constellation, the Great Bear, Ursa Major, is at least 15,000 years old. And we know that because the asterism or representation of the Great Bear is subtly different in East Asia and North America on the one hand versus how it's understood in Europe. In Europe, the asterism, that's the design of which stars connect to which stars, for the Great Bear has the bear with a big long tail. Cy Kellett, let's test your biology knowledge. Do bears have big long tails?
My biology knowledge comes entirely from a stuffed bear I had as a child, but they do not have big long tails.
Correct. They got little stubby tails. So it's weird that in Europe, the great bear has a big long tail, but in East Asia, it doesn't. In East Asia, it's being the three stars of its tail are three hunters that are hunting the bear. And there's another little star up top that is a little bird that's telling the hunters where to go to find the bear. And that's exactly how the Great Bear is interpreted in North America among North American Indians. And what that tells us is that this understanding of the Great Bear must predate the colonization of North America by East Asians coming over the Siberian land bridge, which was a minimum of 15,000 years ago. So the Great Bear, which you can look, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, you can look up in the sky and see it every night and tell your kids about it. It looks like that tradition is a minimum of 15,000 years old. So I think there are deep time traditions, but the idea of one going back to 900,000 years ago, which on anybody's estimation predates the development of modern human speech to pass down the tradition, I think that proposal, even though it's permitted, I think it would stretch the text too far. And so I would tend to, as I mentioned in the Mysterious World episodes that Duff Beer says he listened to, I would tend to prefer other interpretations that also don't insist that the text is literal, but that are based on traditions that the author of Genesis would have had access to. And that doesn't mean they don't contain additional insights that go back further, like the fact that human intelligence is connected with painful childbirth. That's a genuine insight. That's true. I don't think that the author of Genesis got this information by it being passed down from the time that Homo, developed 2 million years ago. But I think he had a valid insight, however he got it, and it is part of the narrative. So that's what I have to say about all that.
Well, I just want to say it one more time. Duff Beer, thank you very much. What a fascinating question. This next one comes from Ann Burke, 6705. How is a narcissist saved if he's in complete denial about being a narcissist?
Well, being a narcissist is a psychological condition that is not itself sinful. Narcissism is a preoccupation with oneself that doesn't give normal levels of compassion to other people. It's kind of related to psychopathy. In fact, narcissism is one of the characteristics of psychopathy, which is a lack of empathy. But these are psychological traits, and they're therefore not sinful in and of themselves. They could lead people to do sinful things. If you're insufficiently compassionate or empathetic to other people, you may not treat them the way you should. But the thing about narcissism and psychopathy is if this is really a personality trait, then it's like a handicap, and you're not going to be fully responsible for how you treat other people. You may be treating other people badly, but your own moral culpability is going to go down. And so it's going to vary from individual to individual depending on the degree of narcissism they have. Some people may have a degree of narcissism, but not so much that it alleviates them of their responsibility for treating other people well. Others may be so narcissistic that they're really not at fault for how they treat other people. And those individuals will be judged differently by God, depending on the state of their heart. If they are fundamentally responsible for their behavior, they will be judged for their behavior. If they are not fundamentally responsible for their behavior, then they won't be judged, accountable for their behavior. The behavior is still bad, but they won't be held accountable for it. And if they otherwise cooperate with God's grace, then they can still be saved.
Anne, thank you very much for that, for the question. This one comes from Shalom Kaysen. Is there a philosophical possibility that God exists without omnipotence? I heard an argument from a liberal Christian, Dr. Goff, which posits that a semi-powerful God would solve many theological quandaries, such as the problem of evil.
So, you do sometimes have finite Godism proposed as a solution to the problem of evil, the idea being that God is still all good and would stop evil from happening if he could. He's just not powerful enough to do so. And finite Godism would solve that problem, but we've got really good evidence for an infinite God. And so I would say, in terms of philosophical possibility, if you mean, can a philosopher imagine this? The answer is yes. But do I think it ultimately would work philosophically? I'd say no. We have really good evidence for the existence of an infinite God who is omnipotent and hypothetically could stop evil. The reason he doesn't, as we discuss frequently on the show, whenever anyone calls in and asks some variant of why does this bad thing happen, the answer is God tolerates it, because this is always the general answer. It's always the same. Evil would not happen if God did not have an equal or greater good that he was going to bring out of that very evil. So God tolerates evil in order to bring about greater good. And that's why it's rational for God to tolerate evil, because he will bring about a greater good. And that makes it tolerable for us to experience evil, because we know a greater good is coming and we won't suffer unjustly. So I agree that if you imagined a God who's not able to stop evil, that would solve your problem of evil, but it would create new problems. Namely, we've got really good evidence for an omnipotent God, and therefore, how do you deal with all that data if you propose just a finite God? So I don't ultimately think that it would be philosophically possible.
Shalom, thank you very much for the question. That brings us to the break. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's Ask Me Anything, internet version with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Hang on, Catholic Answers Live will return in a moment. Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
One of the biggest mistakes a Christian can make is to try to do good without God's help. St. Therese said, when we trust only ourselves and not God, our soul becomes incapable of virtue. Her remedy? Works of charity. And the greatest work of charity is to share the gospel. At St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, we encourage you to share the gospel with someone who doesn't know Jesus. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization, streetevangelization.com.
Mother Angelica had a simple goal when she began EWTN: to reach the world with the gospel message. Today, EWTN is the largest Catholic media organization in the world, broadcasting in multiple languages 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We've never wavered from our mandate to proclaim the truth and majesty of the Catholic faith. Thank you for joining EWTN in this mission.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I just got a detail right before we came back that I just need to clarify this. You can read 10,000 words an hour?
Yeah, approximately.
Oh. Is that like I read if I listen to it at I think 1.25, I think that's the speed I go at, or maybe it's 1.2. Would that be 10,000 words an hour?
Or no, I tend to listen to things at 1.5.
Oh, I might try that.
And that would be 10,000 words in about 40 minutes.
Oh, wow. Okay. By the way, the reason that this came up, I was asking Jimmy about the encyclical from Pope Francis, and it's 31,000 words, and you just said that's about a 3-hour read, and I was like, that's 10,000 words an hour. I've never measured how much I could read in an hour, but all right. Well, it's open forum. It's Ask Me Anything. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and this one comes from Hate, spelled Hagit. Hello, Mr. Akin. What do you think of religious orders?
Well, religious orders are organizations where people join themselves together in some form of common life. It doesn't mean they always live together, but they have a common form of life and spiritual discipline by which they consecrate themselves to the service of God and the service of other humans, either in a direct practical way or via their prayers. And I think it's a good thing to serve God, and I think it's a good thing to serve other human beings. And so I think religious orders are fundamentally good things. They're not meant for everybody, but they are one of the 3 vocations that are recognized in Catholic teaching, the other 2 being matrimony and holy orders. And I think they're good. Now, that doesn't mean every individual religious order or religious house is good. There can be ones that have problems in various degrees, and occasionally there have been ones that have been suppressed because they were really problematic. But on balance, I think that religious orders are good things, and that they correspond to a fundamental desire on the part of some humans to not just consecrate themselves to God in a general way by being people of faith, but to consecrate themselves to God in a more particular way. And we even see in the New Testament the equivalent of an order of religious women, because St. Paul talks about widows who have taken a vow of consecration to Jesus such that they won't remarry. He mentions this in the pastoral epistles. And in the Old Testament, we see a religious order too. We see the Nazarites, where a Nazir or a Nazirah, for the feminine form, take a special rite of consecration to God. They shave their heads. They are not allowed to consume grape products of any form for the term of their consecration, so they can't get drunk, for example. And some Nazarites are Nazarites for life. They take lifelong vows. Others take them for temporary period of time. We have evidence that St. Paul took a Nazirite vow at one time for a limited period. So we see religious orders in the Bible themselves. Incidentally, in modern Hebrew, the word for monk, because, they got Christian monasteries over in Israel, the word for monk is Nazir.
Oh.
Because it's so obvious. The Old Testament Nazirites are the same thing as Christian monks. They use the same word for them. They're Nazirs or Nazirim.
Oh, hey, thanks very much for the question. On we go. Christian Cuber 096 is next. Cuber probably does the Rubik's Cube and those things. Is it a correct understanding of the Catholic faith to say that when Jesus suffered and died, that only his human nature suffered and died, and not the divine person?
It would not, I'm not saying that language can't be used, but it is not the way the church articulates this matter. And if you say it that way, it will be understood as having erroneous implications, because it's not just a nature that suffers, it's a person. If I take a nail and I drive it through one of my feet with a hammer, I don't have my nature suffering. I, the person, Jimmy Akin, am suffering. And since Jesus is one person, that person suffers. It is now, and since he has a divine nature by essence, that means he's a divine person by essence. And so a person that is divine is suffering. If you were to deny that, then now there is a truth in what you're trying to express. His divine nature does not suffer, because his divine nature is impassible. But if you say his divine nature does not suffer, you're right. But if you say a divine person did not suffer, you're wrong. So the locus or place of suffering is not in a nature. It's nature is what it is. It's a complete reality. Natures do not suffer. If we may sometimes speak metaphorically as if they did, but properly speaking, even if you kill 6 million human beings in the Holocaust, human nature does not suffer, because the people you didn't kill still have complete human natures. So natures do not suffer. Persons suffer. Jesus is a divine person, and therefore, to reflect the full truth, we need to say that a divine person suffered. But if you want to say, well, he suffered in his human nature, I know what you're talking about, but you're not saying it right, because properly speaking, natures don't suffer.
Christian Cuber, great question. Thank you very much for that one. I don't know if this is eSpycraft or SBcraft, but I'll go.
Spycraft.
Spycraft is also all right. I'll do that. Spycraft 2005 YT. How to find the truth in the world of excess information?
Well, so I'm sensitive to this. I do lots of research, and I would say a couple of things. The first one is, in a world of excess information, cut out the bad information. Don't waste your time looking at sources that you know are inferior. Look at the best sources that are available. And that way, if you're not looking at the excess information, you're only looking at the high quality information, then that'll make it easier to find truth. Second thing is, as part of looking at the high quality information, you want to look at information from both sides of it, whatever question you're examining, because you want every idea, if you're really trying to find truth, you want it to be able to survive tests. And so you cross-examination by other viewpoints. And so what I do when I'm researching a subject, I try to find the best sources I can on both sides and read them both and think about them both and digest them both and pit them against each other and see which side has the best argument. So I would say it's a two-step process. First step is cut out all the low-quality stuff. And second is take the best of different positions and then play intellectual monster truck rally with them and bash them into each other and see what survives.
Get bashing, Spycraft. Thank you very much for the question. I'm going to keep going because we've got time to get more in, so on we go. EM Show asks this. I would love to know a breakdown of the evidence for and against global warming, and in particular, the degree to which human activity plays a role in this. I ask this of Jimmy because he may be one of the only people I would trust to give an unbiased assessment.
Well, thank you. Thank you, EM. I take that as a compliment. I try to be very, very balanced on matters like this, and it actually relates to the previous question we just had about how to process information and get at the truth. I plan to do one or more Mysterious World episodes dealing with this subject in the future. And as part of my preparation for those episodes, I will do a bunch of research. And so for a number of years, I've been gathering sources on this subject. And like I said, I've tried to gather sources that are anthropomorphic anthropic global warming, human-caused global warming, and other sources that are opposed to that idea. And I plan to have a private intellectual monster truck rally with those positions and bash the arguments of the two camps against each other and see what emerges. I haven't done that yet. So at the moment, I hold my opinions in this area loosely because I may need to change them in the future. But I would say a couple of things that I think I'm pretty confident of at this point. One of them is that both sides need to be taken seriously. We shouldn't just dismiss either one. And secondly, a lot of the claims that you hear about global warming and humanity's role in it are hyperbolic, to put it charitably, or sensationalist, to put it a little less charitably. And frankly, the science shows signs of being cooked in this area. In fact, there are scientists who've done research into the subject who have said, yeah, I had to frame my paper in terms of global warming to make it support the climate, to make it support the scientific journal's preferred climate narrative. They wouldn't have published me if I didn't. So research that supports the idea of human-caused global warming is being promoted right now, whereas the reverse kind of research is not being promoted right now. And that leads to a research imbalance that can favor one narrative out of proportion to the scientific evidence. There also has been evidence of scientific fraud being committed by some practitioners of both sides. But you have scientific fraud is a real thing. It happens in all areas of science at an astonishingly high rate. And it definitely is happening in some global warming science. So those are some things I'm confident of. Do I think it's happening? Do I think humans are playing a notable role in it? Well, I'm open on those questions. I'm not going to rush to humanity as the primary cause because there are other causes. In fact, I saw a paper just the other day come across the Science News documenting that actually in a recent range of years, it was microbes, not humanity, that put more greenhouse gases into the environment. So there are other possibilities that need to be considered. I'll recommend, now it's easy to find stuff supporting man-made global warming. So I won't really focus on that at the moment, but I will give you two resource recommendations that I think would be worth you looking at. One of them is a YouTube channel called the Climate Discussion Nexus. This is a Canadian group that tends to be skeptical of a lot of global warming claims, and they frequently debunk them. So this is a good place to go if you want to see a counter narrative being developed. It's youtube.com/@climatedn. And I also would recommend a book called Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom by Dr. Patrick Moore, who was one of the founders of Greenpeace. And he, and as a founder of Greenpeace, is taken on a bunch of hyperbolic imaginary climate disasters. So fake invisible catastrophes and threats of doom by Dr. Patrick Moore.
EM, thank you for that closing question. You can hear the music. That brings us to the end. We'll have to just say we'll see you next time, God willing, right here on Catholic Answers Live. And thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you, Cy.